Oh my gosh. Those sirens were so loud. Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chaf Tes of Masechta Ayruvin, Daf 29. Lemaisa is just really talking about different stuff you can make Ayruvs with. Apples, wine, vinegar, onions, olives. I wrote bear, but I meant beer. Dates. And then at the end we talk about a little more advice from Abaye's nurse. Remember that from Masechta Shabbos? Let's get started. So, where are we again? Daf Chaf Tes Amud Aleph, about 7-8 lines into the page. Amar Rava. So Rava says something very interesting. Hareini kiven azai b'shukei Tveria. I am like Ben Azai in Shukei Tveria. There's basically, like on Reddit, sometimes they'll say like, ask me anything. That's essentially what Rava was saying. Ask me anything. I am like Ben Azai in the markets of Tveria. Apparently Ben Azai would go out, he was like really, really smart. Right? Rashi says, let's just read Rashi in Dibra Maskal Areini Kiven Azai B'Shukei Tveria, about halfway in. It says, Ben Azai Hayadoresh B'Shukei Tveria, he would, give drushes in the market of Tveria. V'lohaya b'yam of Oker Harim Kimoso. There was nobody as deep as he was and as sharp as he was. Said all the elders of all the wise people of Israel are like peels of garlic in front of me, except for this bald one. I assume that that's a reference to Rabbi Akiva. Anyway, so basically, Rava says, look, I'm in a good mood today. I'm just gonna have open session. Ask me anything. So somebody jumped at the opportunity, and Amar le'Umer Rabbanan, one of the rabbis said, L'Rava to Rava tapuchim b'chama. So he could have asked Rava anything, and he asked him, how many apples do you need to make an Eruv? Alright. Amar le, so Rava said, V'chima Ayruvin b'tapuchin? And Rava responded, are you even allowed to make an Eruv with apples bichlal? And then the Gemara says, why wouldn't you be able to use apples? What's wrong with apples? After all, didn't we learn in a Mishnah, that all food can join together to make a person puzzle with a chatzi pras? What does that mean? So in general, food is not matame a person, right? I guess unless it's an avi avosatoma, but I don't know if food can become an avi avosatoma. It might just only be able to become a rishon. I'm not sure. But the assumption is certainly if it's a rishon or less, it would food would be unable to be matame a person. But if you eat enough tame food, well then it could be matame you to the extent that you can't eat truma immediately afterwards. I guess you'd have to go to the mikveh or something. So how much tame food do you have to eat so that you will no longer be able to eat truma? So we say chatzi pras. If you eat enough food that cumulatively it is half of a pras. Now we know the concept of kedei achilas pras has come up in the past, particularly when we talk about the shiurin and we say that the shear for wheat is that the amount of time you have to wait in a tameh house, which is enough for your clothing to become tameh, which is enough for I think that's what it was. But anyways, for enough time to eat achilas pras, which is, we said, half of a bread that is 8 eggs worth. So that would be 4 eggs. And we're saying chatzi pras is half of that, so 2 eggs. So all sorts of different foods are able to be mitzdarif to create the size of 2 eggs, that if you eat this amount and it's tameh, well then you won't be able to eat truma. I guess probably you have to go to the mikveh or something. Also, all sorts of foods are able to join together to create the required amount, the required share of 2 meals worth for an Eruv. Okay? And all these foods can also join together to create, as we know, that the shear, in order to transfer, for food to be able to transfer tuma, is they have to have the size of a kibetza, of an egg. So all different foods can join together to create the size of an egg. So the Gemara wants to say, of course you can use apples. After all, we're saying that all sorts of foods could join together in order to make the required amount, the required shear for an Eruv. That includes apples. So, but then the Gemara says, V'haimai tiyuvta. What exactly is the question from that Mishnah? If you're going to say, well, what do you mean, what's the question? It says in the Mishnah, Kol ha'ochlin, all sorts of foods can join together for the share of an Eruv. Now, an apple would qualify as all sorts of foods. Apples are after all food. But, think back 2 days. Yochanan said that you can't just learn things out from general rules. And even though the Mishnah says that you can, right, that all sorts of foods can join together for the share of an Eruv, I don't know, you can't rely on that. Then what's the point of the Mishnah if you can't rely on it? But, I don't know. What do you want? I don't know. Josh v'kabel sachar. Learn it and get reward for learning it, even though it's completely not practical. I don't know. But the Gemara says, look, what, are you going to try to bring me a proof from a Mishnah that says that all foods can join together to make an Eruv? Well, you can't rely on the Mishnah because you can't rely on general rules. Even if it gives you the exceptions, there still might be more exceptions. Alright? Well, so good for that Mishnah then. So, so rather, you have to take it one step further. It says that all sorts of foods can join together to make an Eruv. Fine, which we said that we can't use that because you can't just learn things out from general rules. But the very next thing in the Mishnah is that they can also join together for Tumas Ochlin. So therefore, combining those two together, we can now paint a more full picture, which is V'haninami b'nei tamuye Tumas Ochlin ninu. Now, apples are shaykh to Tumas Ochlin, right? And therefore, what we want to say is that we're comparing the foods that join together for an Eruv together with foods that can be Matami Tumas Ochlim. Apples are able to be Matami Tumas Ochlim, therefore it would make sense to say that they're also usable for an Eruv. Very nice. Okay, so you can use an apple to make an Eruv, or maybe a few apples to make an Eruv. Fine. V'chama, how many apples do you need? So Rav Nachman, tapuchim b'kav. So Rav Nachman says 1 kav's worth of apples. I don't know exactly how much that is. I guess a few apples, I don't know. Meisvei. We have a kasha, however. Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, that we have a brisa in which Reb Shimon ben Elazar says, Uchla Tavlin, that when it comes to Meiser Ani, okay, what's Meiser Ani? Who can tell me? Meiser Ani is that we know, oh, another siren. 1 second, I'm just going to pause this till it ends. Wow, there were 2 sirens going at once. I do not understand why all of a sudden there's just like non-stop sirens in this town. I don't know. Okay, anyways, so Meiser Ani. So out of the Shemitah cycle, so on years 1 and 2 and 4 and 5, so in addition to Truma and Meiser, you also take Meiser Sheni. On years 3 and 6, so instead of Meiser Sheni, you take Meiser Ani, which is that same 10% that you would do for Meiser Sheni. Instead of bringing it to Jerusalem and eating it there, or of course transferring it to money and buying food, you distribute this Meiser to poor people. So what we're saying is there is a minimum amount. If you can afford it, you really shouldn't, there's a minimum amount that you should give to each person. And as Rashi says in the Dibra Maskal Reb Shimon ben Elazar, so he points out that the pasuk says, "V'nasata lalevi lager liyasum v'lamanu." You have to give it. Uvatzu me'achi lo avin nesina. If it's less than the amounts that we're going to list now, then it wouldn't be considered giving. So Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, uchla tavlin. So you have to give an uchla of spices. An uchla is 1/8 of a log. Okay, v'litra yerek, and 1 log of vegetables. Ve'asara egozen, if you're giving nuts, you got to give 10 nuts. Ve'chamisha forsaken, 5 peaches. V'shnei rimonim, 2 pomegranates. Ve'esrog echad, and just 1 esrog. Okay, fine. Ve'amar gursak bar dari, mishmei Rav Menashe bar shaguvli. Who are these people? Mishmei Rav, I know who that is. V'chein le'eruv, that the same thing applies to an eruv. Okay, that whatever these shi'urim are for Meiser Ani, the same shi'ur would apply to an Eruv. And says the Gemara, And the Gemara's kasha is against Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman said that when it comes to apples, you have to have a kav of apples for your eruv. Now, the question is that when it comes to Meiser Ani, we said that the minimum amount for peaches is 5 peaches. So the Gemara wants to ask that, if Rav says that the same shear by Meiser Ani would be for eruv, but Meiser Ani all you need is 5 peaches, well then apples are kind of similar to peaches, so wouldn't it make sense to say that by eruv all you need is 5 apples? So why does Rav Nachman say you need a whole kav? I assume that a kav is larger. I'm assuming that a kav is larger than 5 apples. And therefore, why would Rav Nachman say that you need a whole kav if after all we compare eruv to Meiser Ani, and by Meiser Ani you just need 5 peaches? Well then, apples are kind of like peaches. Maybe you just need 5 apples for your eruv. So the Gemara answers, Hani chshive v'ani lo chshive. Interesting answer. So the Gemara says, well, peaches are more chashuv, they're more important, they're more significant than apples are. And therefore, while all you need is 5 peaches, you need more apples. And it's very interesting because what do you see from here? You see from this answer that Mazon Shtei Sudis doesn't mean that you have to have enough food to satisfy you for 2 meals, right? Because if that was the case, well, if we're determining that it's, a meal is 5 peaches, so then, or not a meal, if we're saying that the minimum shear, let's say for an ani is 5 peaches, and we're applying that also to eruv, that will be the same amount. So then essentially what that means is enough to be satisfied with, for 2 meals is going to be 5 peaches. And if that's the case, then the same would apply to apples. But we're saying it's not about, how much it is to be satisfied. It means how much would you normally eat at 2 meals? And what this means is like, if you think about a piece of cake, for example, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to have, 2 meals worth of cake. That might be like, if all you're going to eat is cakes, then maybe you need to have 2 full cakes. No, it means how much cake would you generally eat at a meal times 2. So if if you're going to have, let's say, cake for dessert, maybe you'll have a slice of cake. So you have to have 2 slices of cake, 1 for each meal, right? So what it means is Mazon Shtei Sudis doesn't necessarily mean the amount of food that it takes you to satisfy you for 2 meals. It means how much of this particular food would you have over the course of 2 meals. And therefore what we're saying is that peaches are more chashuv than apples are. And therefore, while peaches, maybe, 5 peaches would be enough for 2 meals, but peaches are more chashuv. They're more important. You're not going to have as much of them. Apples already are not as chashuv as peaches. Therefore, you would have more of them. You wouldn't be as restrained when it comes to apples. You would have more apples. Interesting. Amar Rav Yosef Shara Le'mari Rav Menashe Bar Shagvoli. No, Bar Shaguvli. So Rav Yosef says God will have to forgive Rav Menashe Bar Shaguvli. Ana Amrisa Niale Amasnisim Vu Amra Abraisa. I told him the statement of Rav that V'chein Be'eruv in the context of the Mishnah that I'm about to explain. And for some reason, Rav Menashe Bar Shaguvli taught Rav's statement of V'chein Le'eruv to Gursak Bardari on that brisa that you just quoted about Meiser Ani. So Rav Yosef is saying, I don't understand why Rav Menashe Bar Shaguvli changed what I taught him, which was that Rav's statement was on the Mishnah I'm about to explain, and instead taught it to his students as going on the brisa that he just quoted about Meiser Ani. Alright? Titnan, as we learn in the Mishnah. And postin la'ani begorin. So if also in the context of Meiser Ani, so we're saying that we do not give to a poor person when it comes to Meiser Ani less than 1/2 of a kav chitin, right? And postin la'ani begorin mechatzi kav chitin. You don't give him less than 1/2 a kav of chitin, v'kav sa'orin. And when it comes to barley, you would give him 1 full kav. Rav Meir Omer Chatzi Kav Sorin. Rav Meir says that also when it comes to barley, it's also 1/2 a kav. Fine. V'kav v'chetzi kusmin. If it's spelt, you're going to give him 1.5 kavs. V'kav grogris. And when it comes to figs, you'll give him 1 kav. O mana dvela. Now, if these are pressed figs, so you'd give him 1 portion, which I believe is basically 8 eggs worth. Rabbi Kiva Omer Pras. Rabbi Kiva says Pras, which is half that amount, which I guess would be 4 eggs worth. V'chatzi log yayin, you'd give him half of a log of wine. Rabbi Kiva Omer Revius. Rabbi Kiva says all you need to give him is 1/4 of a log of wine. Revius shemen, you give him 1/4 of a log of oil. Rabbi Akiva Omer Shminis. Kiva says 1/8 of a log of oil. Ushar kol aperis, and when it comes to any other fruits, Samar Abashal Kadei Shimkrim Vikach Ben Mazun Shtei Sudis, you would give this ani by Meiser ani, you would give him enough of any other food so that if you would sell it, he would be able to use that money to buy enough food for 2 meals. Okay? And Rav says the same exact thing applies to Eruv. So Rav Yosef is saying that he doesn't understand. He taught Rav Menashe bar Shaguvli, he taught the statement of Rav, that v'chein le'eruv. He taught that to Rav Menashe bar Shaguvli in the context of this Mishnah that Rav Yosef just quoted, and he doesn't understand for the life of him why Rav Menashe bar Shaguvli taught v'chein le'eruv regarding that brisa that he quoted about Meiser Ani. So the Gemara says, Umay ume dahai mehach. And the Gemara says, what's the big deal? Why is Rav Yosef getting so dramatic? Why does it make such a big difference if Rav Menashe bar Shaguvli taught this statement on the Mishnah that Rav Yosef apparently taught it to him upon, versus if Rav Menashe bar Shaguvli taught the statement of Rav regarding the brisa that Rav Menashe bar Shaguvli wanted to teach it about? What's the big deal? The net result is the same, that the halachis of the halachis of Meiser Ani apply to Eruv, and it's not like the Mishnah and the Brisa are arguing on each other. They're just adding different components, right? The Mishnah is talking, that Brisa is talking about peaches and nuts and things like that. This Mishnah is talking about wine and oils and things like that, but there is no machlokas between the two. And what's the difference if Rav Menashe bar Shaguvli taught v'chein le'eruv on the Brisa or the Mishnah? If you're going to say, well, because the brisa that Rav Menashe bar Shaguvli mentioned, well, there it talks about needing, requiring 1/8 of a log of spices. And spices you can't just eat plain. And we know from yesterday that in an Eruv, you have to use something that you can eat immediately, right? That's why we said that immature dates you can't use, because you can't eat them immediately, even though you might be able to put them over a fire and then eat them, but you're not doing that now. You need to be able to eat them now. So maybe why Rav Yosef was getting dramatic is because how could Rav Menashe bar Shaguvli possibly say that the statement of Rav, of v'chein le'eruv, in the context of that brisa talks about spices, and spices can't be used as an eruv. But, atu hacha milo katani chitin v'sorin v'lav b'nei chilininu. But in that Mishnah that Rav Yosef quoted, we're also talking about wheat and barley. You can't eat wheat and barley immediately. You make it into, flour and all sorts of stuff. So Ella, Mishum de katane chatzi log yayin v'amarav ma'arvim b'shtei revi'iyos shel yayin. The Gemara answers, the reason why Rav Yosef cared so much is because it seems to be clear that Rav's statement is really going on that Mishnah, because after all, that Mishnah says that you use 1/2 of a log of wine for an Eruv. And we also know that Rav says that you make an Eruv with 2 revi'iyos of wine, and 2 revi'iyos of wine is 1/2 of a log of wine, i.e., we know that Rav holds just like that Mishnah, right? So it makes sense that for Rav to say, right? So as the Gemara says, you could skip this, the Agosabach skips the next few words. So that's a rather shmamina, ki amar Rav v'chein le'eruv ahal masnisin kama shmamina. So from the fact that we know that Rav says that when it comes to wine, the shear of wine for an Eruv is 1/2 a log, which is, well, he says 2 revi'iyos, but that's 1/2 a log. And the Mishnah says 1/2 a log. It makes sense that when Rav also says v'chein be'eruv, that he would be talking about that Mishnah. And that is why Rav Yosef does not understand for the life of him why, if he taught Rav Menashe bar Shaguvli that Rav says v'chein le'eruv in the context of this Mishnah, which seems to make a lot of sense because Rav says that the shear of wine for an Eruv is the exact same shear that the Mishnah says. Why would Rav Menashe bar Shaguvli be saying Rav's opinion of V'chein le'Eruv in the context of some random, well not random, but some other brisa? Why? Amar Mar, we said earlier, Uvmazon shtei sudis le'eruv, that different foods can join together for the share of two foods, of two meals for an eruv. Savar Rav Yosef lememar adika suda mehai usuda mehai. So Rav Yosef thought to say that what this means is that you have to have, meaning two foods, let's say, can join together to make your, 2 meals worth for your eruv. But Rav Yosef thought to say that you would have to have 1 meal's worth of, let's say, I don't know, chvaisnish. Let's say you had meat and chicken. So you'd have to have 1 meal's worth of meat and another meal's worth of chicken. But not like, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So, Amar le Rabba responded to Rav Yosef, Afilu mechza l'shlis l'revia. No, it doesn't literally have to be so neat. You don't need 1 meal of this and 1 meal of that. And that's what it means that they can be mitzvah for the Eruv. No, you can even have a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Even if it's a, half of this and half of that, or a third or a quarter, as long as, in total there is enough for 2 meals, well then you got yourself an Eruv. Gufa, we said earlier, Amar Rav, said Rav, Me'arvin b'shtei revi'iyos shel yayin. So you can make an Eruv with 2 revi'iyos of wine. Umi ba'inan kulei hai? Do you really need so much wine? First of all, 2 revi'iyos of wine is not very much. It's basically like a glass of wine, essentially. Ve'atanya, how much, ve'atanya, but we learn in the Brisa, Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, says Reb Shimon ben Elazar, yayin k'dei lechol bo, that you need in your Eruv enough wine. I think it's talking about an Eruv. Unless he's talking about, he might still be talking about Meiser Ani. I'm not sure actually. It's a good question. I don't know, because Rav Shimon Elazar keeps on talking about Meiser Ani. But either way, the assumption is certainly that whatever Rav Shimon ben Elazar is saying, it would be relevant to Eruv. That's for sure. Either because he's saying it about Eruv or because he's saying it about Meiser Ani, but we basically say that the Shurim by Meiser Ani are the same thing by Eruv. So Rav Shimon ben Elazar Omer, K'dei lechol bo. So when it comes to Rayayin K'dei lechol bo, that you need enough wine just in order to eat it, meaning in order to dip your bread into wine and eat that. I guess that was sometimes a thing, to take bread, dip it in wine, and you can eat it. So that's all you need, just enough dipping wine, not 2 revi'iyos to drink. So chometz kedei l'tabel bo, you need enough vinegar in order to be able to dip stuff into the vinegar, and we're going to explain all these things in a minute. Zeisim uvtzalim kedei le'echol bo and shtei sudis, and enough olives and onions that you would be able, enough olives and onions that you would eat over the course of 2 meals. Fine, we're going to explain all these things. But the question is, so why would Rav require so much wine, that, 2 revi'iyos of wine, if apparently we have a brisa that says that all you really need is enough wine to dip your bread into, which is less than that. So the Gemara answer is a very interesting answer. Hasam b'chamer mivashla. That brisa is talking about cooked wine. That you don't normally drink cooked wine. You use cooked wine for dipping. And because you use cooked wine for dipping, so that's why it's a lesser amount. But when Rav says that for your Eruv you would need 2 revi'iyos, that is non-cooked wine, i.e. drinking wine. And to drink wine you would have more, you would have 2 revi'iyos. What's interesting is that we're saying that specifically cooked wine is for dipping, non-cooked wine is for drinking. Interesting in sort of the whole discussion about yayin mevushal and things like that. The Gemara seems to be saying that they would drink wine, drinking wine is non-mevushal wine. Interesting. Amar Mar. So we also said earlier, as we just said, chometz kedei l'tabel bo, that for your Eruv you'll have enough vinegar in order to dip in it. So Amar Rav Gidol, Amar Rav, k'dei l'tabel bo mazon shtei sudas shel yerek. So Rav Gidol says the name of Rav. What this means is enough vinegar that if you have 2 vegetable-based meals, so you would have enough vinegar to dip all your vegetables in it. Okay? Igada Amrei, Amar Rav Gidol Amar Rav Yerek Hanechol B'Shtei Sudes. No, so there are those who say that Rav Gidol Amar Rav says something slightly different, which is not a meal that is comprised essentially of vegetables, and you'd have to have enough vinegar for all those vegetables. No, what it means is that the amount of vegetables that you would generally eat over the course of 2 meals, so enough vinegar to be able to dip those vegetables into it, which is going to be less than if the entire meal consisted of vegetables. Okay? So if you want to make your Eruv with onions or with olives, so you have to have enough onions or olives that you would eat during 2 meals. But do you make an Eruv with onions? But we learn in the Brisa, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, says Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Pamachas Shabbos Reb Meir be'Ardiska. One time, Reb Meir was spending Shabbos in a town called Ardiska. And a certain fellow came before Reb Meir, Amrlo, and he said to Reb Meir, Eravti b'bitzalim l'tivin. I made an Eruv, and I used for my Eruv onions so that I can get to Tivin. What this means is that this person wanted to get to a place called Tiv'in on Shabbos. Now, Tiv'in was more than 2,000 amos away from where he lived. So what he did was he made an Eruv Chatzeres somewhere in the middle so that he'll be able to get from that, essentially travel from his town to get to his Eruv Chatzeros, and then continue another 2,000 amos after his Eruv Chatzeros. No, not Eruv Chatzeros, Eruv Tchumen. So he made an Eruv Tchumen, outside of his, so an Eruv Tchumen somewhere in the middle, so that he'll be able to travel from his town to get to that Eruv Tchumen, and then continue an additional 2,000 amos and get to this place called Tiv'in. Now, along the way was also this place called Ardiska, where Reb Meir was. Now, Ardiska was already outside of the 2,000 amos from his town, and as long as this Eruv Tchumen was made of acceptable ingredients, of acceptable foods, well then it would be no problem. However, if this Eruv Tchumen was not a kosher Eruv Tchumen, well then he had no right traveling to Ardiska, because that was already 2,000 amos away from his house. Okay? So, he relied on this Eruv nonetheless, and he made it all the way to Ardiska, and it was Shabbos, and he says to Reb Meir, hey, Rabbi Meir, by the way, the reason why I was able to travel here from my house was because I made an Eruv Tchumen along the way, and the food that I used for my Mozen Shtei Sudas was onions. So, Ve'oshivo Reb Meir ba'arba amos shalod, Reb Meir says, don't move for the rest of Shabbos. Basically what Reb Meir was saying is that your Eruv is not a good Eruv. You've already walked more than 2,000 amos away from your house, and do not move because you cannot walk any further. So, what do we see? So we see that clearly onions don't work for an Eruv. So how come we're saying that if you want to make an Eruv with onions, it has to be enough for the amount of onions that you would eat over the course of 2 meals? So, lo kasha haba olim haba imos. So the answer is, well, it depends which part of the onion you used. If you use like the bulb of the onion, if you use like the part of the onion that we generally use, so then that would be fine. You can use that. If you use the leaves of the onion, then that would be a problem. And this fellow, he made an Eruv Tchumen with the leaves of an onion. The Tanyas, we learn in the Brisa, Achal batzol ve'ishkim v'meis. If a fellow eats onions, and then he wakes up in the morning and he dies, ein omer mima meis. We don't say, I wonder what he died from. It's obvious what he died from. He died from the onion leaves. Alright. V'amar Shmuel, it says Shmuel the doctor, Lo shanu ela ba'alim ava bi'imos leislan ba. So Shmuel clarifies for us that exactly, it's talking about the onion leaves, but if it was the onion bulb itself, that would be a problem, and if you died in the morning, we could ask the question and say, I wonder why this fellow died. Alright? And even when it comes to eating the leaves, we say it's only a problem ela delo ivtzil zersa, if they're not the size of a zeres. A zeres is the size from your thumb to your pinky, like this amount if you're watching the video. And if you're not, then just look at the space from your thumb to your pinky. Okay. Aval ivtzil zersa leislan ba. But if the leaves are large enough that they're the size of a zeres, well then it's mature enough that it won't kill you. And I guess you could probably then use it for an Eruv. Amar Papa lo amaran ela lo ishte shichra, val ishte shichra leizlan ba. So Papa points out that it's only dangerous if you don't drink beer afterwards. If you drink beer afterwards, then it's fine. And interestingly, Rav Papa often you see him making statements about beer like this, and conveniently he was in the beer business, so it was good PR. Saves you from dying from onion leaves. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbi said, person shouldn't eat onions because of the poison that's in it. There was a story with Rav Papa, no, not Rav Papa, with Rav Chanina. The Rav Chanina ate half of an onion, which of course included half of its poison, and he got sick, and he was mamish going to die. So all of his friends prayed for him, and then he lived. Because I guess the world still needed Rav Chanina, so he was able to not die. Very nice. Amar Reb Zera, said Reb Zera, Amar Shmuel, in the name of Shmuel. Sheichar ma'arvin bo fosel samikva, v'shloshes lugin. So beer, you can use beer in your Ayruvin, in your Eruv. You can use beer in your Eruv. And also, if there is 3 logs of beer in a mikvah, so then the mikvah will be pasul. Okay? Maskefla Rav Kana pshita. So Rav Kana says that's obvious. V'chima bein zeh lemetzeva. So Rav Kana says it's obvious that 3 logs of beer will make the mikvah pasul, because why should beer be any different than colored water? And colored water passes the mikvah d'tnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi Omer meitzeva posanis mikvah b'shloshes lugin, that colored water will make your mikvah pasul if there's 3 logs of it. So if colored water makes your mikvah pasul, well, why should I assume that beer should be any different? Amri Hasam, they say it's different because over there, mai detziva mikre hacha shichre ikre, because colored water is called just that, colored water. So therefore, it makes sense to assume that that's mayim she'uvin, that it's water that's not allowed for the mikvah, and it'll pass on the mikvah. But this is called beer. It's not called, barley water carbonated fermented drink. It's called beer, and therefore I might not necessarily assume that beer would be posel the mikvah. So that is what Reb Zera is telling us in the name of Shmuel, that beer is in fact posel the mikvah if there are 3 logs of it. Uv'chama me'arvin, and how much beer do you need in order to make a eruv? Savar Rav Acha Brei de Rav Yosef Kami de Rav Yosef le'meimar. So Rav Acha Brei de Rav Yosef was in front of, his father Rav Yosef, and he thought to say, betrain riv'ei shechra, that you need 2, not reviuses, right? Usually a revius, I believe, implies a quarter of a log, but this is talking about a quarter of a kav, i.e. 1 log, right? And we're saying betrain riv'ei shechra, so you need 2 logs of beer. So whereas by wine, you would need 2 quarters of a log of wine, i.e. half of a log of wine. Here, with beer, Rav Acha Brei Rav Yosef thought to say that you would need 4 times the amount of beer, meaning 4 times the amount of wine. Well, whatever the amount of wine is, times 4 is how much beer you would need, which is 2 logs of beer. How come? Kidetnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Motzi Yayin. So when it comes to Hotzah, we know all about Hotzah from Masechta Shabbos. So when it comes to wine, if you're going to take that out from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, Kidei Mezigas HaKos. So you're chayiv if you take out enough wine that you would pour into a cup and then mix it together with water. So however much wine you would put into the cup before you would then mix in the water, so that is how much wine you'd be chayiv if you take out. So, Vitani Allah, and it was taught about it, Kidei Mezigas Kos Yafe. This means enough wine that you would put and mix into a Kos Yafe, a very nice, beautiful cup. My Kos Yafe, what's this very nice, beautiful cup? Kos Shel Bracha. A cup that you'd make a bracha on, maybe Kiddush, something like that. Okay, V'amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabbi bar Avua. Kos Shel Bracha tzarich sheyebo rova revius, Kidei sheyim zigenu v'yamar al revius. And Rav Nachman says the name of Rabbi bar Avua, that a kos shel bracha, you put in a quarter of a revius, a revius of a log. Is that what we said? Rova revius. Well, 1/4 of a revius. I guess a quarter of a revius of a kav. All these reviuses are like, you have to keep track of what's what. But this means a quarter of a log, right? Meaning, And I think that's just like a plain old revius. So a quarter of a log of wine. So that when you add the water, you will have one total of a log of wine. And it's like Rava, the Amar Rava, kol chamer delodari al chad plus maya lab chamrahu. That any wine that you don't have to add 3 parts water to it, it's not really considered strong enough, it's not really considered good wine. So what Rav Nachman is saying in the name of Rabbi Bar Avua, that a kosher bracha, you put in a quarter of a log of wine, and then you add 3 parts water, and now you get your log of wine total. Fine. V'katani seifa. And we say in that seifa of that same Mishnah, that all other mashkin is not a quarter of revius, it's rather a complete revius, i.e. it's a complete log, right? All other mashkin and also, dirty waters. But, so what do we see? That all other mashkin, so whereas wine, you're chayav for otza'ah when it comes to a quarter of a log. However, all other mashkin, including beer, you'll be chayav for otza'ah and Shabbos when it is a full log. And since when it comes to otza'ah and Shabbos, the amount of beer that you would take out and be chayav for is 4 times the amount that you'd be chayav for wine. So let's say here as well, when it comes to Eruv, it would be 4 times the amount of beer as wine. And we know that wine is half a log, right? As Rav said, and as that Mishnah had said, 2 reviuses of wine. So that's half a log of wine. So beer would be 4 times that amount, which is 2 logs of beer. That is what Rav Acha Breid Rav Yosef wanted to argue. Velohi, but it's not the case. Hasamhu debatzu me'achi lo chashiv, that when it comes to otzah, what's important is what's significant, what's important. And when it comes to significance, so wine is significant at a revius, beer is significant at 2 logs. Aval hacha lo, so you can, there's a different gear, so it changes lo davide or to avide. So aval hacha avide inshe deshasu kasa betzafa v'kasa b'fani v'samchi lavayu. However, when it comes to eruv, it's about having mazon shtei sudas, enough beer for 2 meals. And there are people who drink a cup of beer in the morning, or revius, essentially, a revius halog, a quarter of a log of beer in the morning, and another quarter of a log of beer in the evening, and that's enough for them. So even though, in terms of chashivos and for Shabbos, you would require 2 logs of beer, in terms of eruv, it would be about what people drink, and 2 quarters of a log, i.e. the same shear of wine, would be enough for eruv. And there's another siren, so I'm just going to pause this. I will be right back. Okay, I hope you enjoyed your break. Tamar and Bechama, how many dates do you need? Another siren. I'll be right back. Alright, let's try that again. Tamar and Bechama. So if you want to make your eruv with dates, so how much dates do you need? So Amar Rav Yosef, Tamar and Bekav. So Rav Yosef said, if you want to make an eruv with dates, so you use a kav of dates. Amar Rav Yosef, Mina Aminallah. And Rav Yosef says, how do I know that if you're making an eruv with dates, you use a kav of dates? Titana is, we learn in the Brisa, Achal grogros v'shilem tamarim tavo ala bracha. That if a person ate if a person ate figs of truma by accident, and now he has to pay them back, if instead of paying back with figs, he paid back with dates, wow, he should mamish be blessed. He did a very generous thing. So heichidami. Now, what exactly is the relationship between figs and dates? That by when he ate the figs by accident and he paid them back with dates, it was such a generous thing that he did. If we're saying that, he ate $1 worth of figs and he paid back $1 worth of dates, right? So my tava la bracha. So what's so generous about what he did? He ate it, right? So I said $1, swap out $1 for zuz. So then what is the big chiddush over here? He ate a zuz worth of figs. He's paying back the equivalent zuz, but instead of figs, of dates. So what's so generous about what he did? He ate a zuz worth, he returned a zuz worth. So elalav, so says Rav Yosef, it must be lefi mida. No, it must be what's so generous about what he did is that he's returning the same measure of what he ate of figs, he's returning in dates, and the dates, that same measure, is worth a lot more, right? He ate, let's say, a kilo of figs, and he's returning a kilo of dates, and the price of a kilo of dates is more expensive than of figs. The achomine griva de grogris de shavi zuza become mishalim le griva de tmarim de shavi arba. So what it means that he ate a certain measure of figs that are worth 1 zuz, and he's returning the same measure of dates which are worth 4 zuz. That is what is so generous about what he did. V'katani tava alav bracha, and it says that he should be blessed for what he did. So alma tmar madife. So we see that dates are more chashuv than figs, and we saw in the Mishnah that we quoted earlier with Rav Yosef that he said that Rav says v'chein le'eruv. In that Mishnah it said that the shiur for Meiser Ani, which we're saying is the same for Eruv, is a kav of figs. And therefore, if we're now arguing that dates are more expensive than figs, well then certainly, a kav of dates would be more than enough for your Eruv. So, Alma Tamar Madife, fine. So Amalei Abai. So Abai says to Rav Yosef, Le'olam da'achal mine bezuza v'kam mishalim bezuza. Abai responds to Rav Yosef and he says, look, I could argue that what it means is that he ate 1 zuz worth of figs and he returned 1 zuz worth of dates. Well, if that's the case, then umay tava alav bracha. Well, then why should he be blessed? What's so generous about what he did? He accidentally ate the value of a zuz and he returned that same exact value. What's so special? So the Gemara answers, what's so special is the achomine midi de lo kafetz alei zabina v'kam shanle midi de kafetz alei zabina. So apparently, it's easier to sell dates than it is to sell figs. And even though he is returning the same exact value that he ate, but it's going to be much easier for him to, I guess dates are more popular than figs are. And therefore, even though it's the same dollar amount, or in this case, zuz amount, but he's giving something that is more beloved. And therefore, so in the context of selling, the reason why I'm not saying selling is because, we're talking about truma here. Why would he eat truma by accident? Why would he be selling it? But I guess the point is something that is a lot more popular. So therefore, even though he's giving the same value, but he's giving back the same value of something that is more beloved. But in terms of value, they could very well be the same amount, or maybe even figs cost more than dates, and therefore maybe you need more than a kav of dates in order to, for your Eruv. So based on Abai, it's inconclusive. You cannot assume that dates are more expensive than figs, and therefore if a kav of figs works, then certainly a kav of dates work. Not necessarily. Shtisa, when it comes to shtisa, which is, we've seen it pop up every so often. I think it's like some kind of porridge kind of thing. Some kind of like roasted like flour and then oil and honey and stuff. Amr v'acha bar pinchas tre sharguse. So if you want to make a eruv with shtisa, you need 2 spoonfuls of it. Kisane, if you want to make a eruv with roasted grains, well then Amr abai tre bune de pumpadisa. You need to use 2 bune de pumpadisa. Amr abai Amr li aim. Abai said that his mother, i.e. like his nurse that raised him, said, Hani kisane malu liliba. These roasted grains are good for your heart. Umuvatlim machshavta, and they're also, they get rid of any bad sort of fears that you might have. V'amar Abai, and says Abai, Amr li'em, my nurse told me, Haiman de isle chulsha de liba, somebody who has a weak heart. Laisi bisra de atma yemina de dichra. So what you should do is you should take meat from the right thigh of a ram, V'laisi kabuya de re'isa de nisan, and then take dung from cattle from the month of Nisan. Ve'ileka kabuya de re'isa, but if you don't have dung from cattle from the month of Nisan, laisi sugyani de arvasa, so then you could take twigs from a willow tree, v'nechbave, and you could burn either the dung or the twigs depending on what you have available. V'nechol, and then you cook the meat on that dung or twigs, v'nechol, and eat it, v'nishte basri chamer, and drink it with wine, marka, with diluted wine, and then your heart issues will be history. Friends, we'll stop there. That was daf Chavtes of Masechta Ayruvin. So, I mean, the main theme was basically just different types of things that you can use for an Eruv. So we talked about using apples for an Eruv. Rav Nachman said that was a kav of apples. Talked about using wine for an Eruv. Rav had said that you need 2 revius of 2 quarters of a log of wine for 2 meals. We talked about vinegar, onions, olives, beer, dates. Beer we said you would need. I think we concluded that it was the same amount as wine. Dates, Rav Yosef wanted to say a kav. Abai said you can't necessarily assume that it's a kav because you don't necessarily know, you can't necessarily prove the price of dates relative to figs. And then some interesting things from Abai's mom about fixing your broken heart or your weak heart. I don't know. Have a great day. Peace. Bye.